rest of Shlishi. I think
we're going to read again through the first Mishnah and we'll continue on. Amar lahem hamimuneh, Tzu'uru im higia zman hashchita. Im higia haroeh omer barkai. Matitya ben Shmuel omer ha'ir pnei kol mizrach ad shebechevron. Who omer hein. So the Muneh, the Kohen who's appointed to organize the Avodot in the Beit HaMikdash, so when it was the morning time, he would tell them, go out and see if it's time to do the shechita, time to do the slaughtering of the Tamid Shel Shachar. Im higia, if the time has come, haroeh omer barkai. So the person who sees it calls out barkai, like light, like it's shining. Matitya ben Shmuel omer he'ir pnei kol hamizrach she'ad shebechevron v'omer hein. So what I will just point out, there's the Gemara here actually has a couple of readings in this Mishnah. It's not clear who says what. So I put the question mark here, and I read it the way the Bartenura reads it. So just to review, in the Bartenura, Amar Mamimuneh, who has skan, he's the vice Kohen. Su'uru al makom gavoa shaya lehem b'mikdash. Go out and look on a high place that was there, that they had in the big Beit HaMikdash. If it's man shchita, and Bartenura explains, shchita psula balayla. Shchita is pasul when it's night. Shnemar biyom zivchavchem. So they had to make sure that it was daytime when they did the shchita. So whoever sees it calls out barkai, meaning he'ir v'hivri kashachar. The morning has lit up and is shining. And Matitya ben Shmuel says Ha'ir pnei kol mizrach. And Bartenura explains man ze achar barkai damar tanakama. So barkai is like, when he calls out barkai, that it's light and shiny. This was a particular point at sunrise that people knew. They would say, oh, this is barkai now. This, now there's enough light, we would call it barkai. He'ir pnei mizrach is more, it's more light. V'alacha kamatitya ben Shmuel. Ad shebechevron, otan ha'omdim lamata shoalin lo. So this is how the Bartenura reads. He says, when Matityahu ben Shmuel says what he says, this is what he's saying. He's saying that people who were on the ground, who would not climb up to this high place in the Beit HaMikdash, they would ask the person who had gone up, He'ir pnei kol mizrach ad shebechevron. Otan ha'omdim lamata sho'alin lo, higia ha'or lechevron. They were asking him, can you see the light all the way to Hebron? V'hu meshiv hein. And he would answer them, yes. So why did they want to know that it was light all the way to Hebron? This is from the Yerushalmi here. It says this is just to the Zchut Avot were buried in Hebron, that they wanted to mention Hebron in this context of starting the Avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. So Mishnah Bet. So Mishnah Bet is like a bit of a digression. It's like a parenthesis. V'lama hutzrechu lechach. And why did they need this? So what's the question? Why did they need what?
Why did they need to ask about the sun?
Right. Why did they need to ask about if the sun had come up, if the time had come? Why did they have to have this special person climb up and make sure that they saw a sunrise? Because one time the light of the moon had come up, and they imagined that the east had lit up. In other words, that it was actually a lot hashachar. And they ended up shachting the korban tamid. And they took it out to the place where korbanot psulim are burnt. So that seems pretty straightforward. But it tells us something. It tells us that this practice of tzuru v'giyas manashkita wasn't always there. It used to be that people apparently, they would just look up and, even not in a high place, and they would judge based on how well lit the azara was that the sun had started to come up. But they found out that that's not reliable, because sometimes the moonlight might fool you into thinking that the sun is up, and it's not. So the Bartenura explains, Shapamachat Allah ma'or ha'avana. So he goes out his way to explain, La b'yoma kippurim kama. This is not telling us something that actually happened on Yom Kippur, though this is our general context in the Masechet. Di'afshar la'alot ma'or ha'lavana samuch l'shachar b'yom kippurim. It's impossible that you would get a moonrise that would be close to the shachar on Yom Kippur. That's not where the moon is going to be at sunrise. Right? On the 10th of Tishrei, on Yom Kippur, we're a third of the way through the month. It would be at the end of one of the months. This happened close to the end of a month, at a time when the moon going up would go up close to the time of Alot HaShachar. That's when this mistake happened. And so they were worried that perhaps on Yom Kippur, another mistake like this would happen. And that's why they needed all of this. By the way, before we go on, I forgot to mention, Michael Werner asked me to dedicate this shir for the refuah shlema of his father, Shlomo ben Chaya. So may he have a refuah shlema. I believe he's undergoing a procedure, or just had a procedure. I'm not sure, but we should wish him a refuah shlema.
Refuah shlema.
Just a second. I will just point out that the basic part of this mission that we see here, we see similarly in Masechet Tamid. Just a second. Yeah. And I've been working on this. I'm having some hitlabtuyot about how much of Masechet Tamid we should do, but I do think that we should look at some of Masechet Tamid. All of these things about the order of what took place in the Beit HaMikdash, not only on Yom Kippur, but every day, we find in different places. Yoma that we're learning is actually one of the sources for a lot of things about how, the way, how we know how things took place in the Beit HaMikdash. But as we've mentioned in the past, one of the other prominent sources is in Masechet Tamid. And I'll just take a moment to point out here in the Mishnah, this is in the third chapter of Tamid. Amar lahem ha'memuneh bo ha'afisu mishochet mizorek mibedashen mizbech ha'pnimi mibedashen et ha'menorah mimalei varim lekevesh הראש והרגל ושתי הידיים, העוקץ והרגל, החזה והגרה, שתי דפנות, הקרביים והסורת והחביתים והיין, הפיסו זכה מי שזכה. Okay, so the Mimuneh gathered everybody together to do the payis before everything gets started, right? Because you have to appoint everybody to do their job. And then we see in Mishnah Bet, Amar lahem ha'mimuneh tzuru im higia zman hashchita. Im higia haroeh omer bakai, Matya ben Shmuel omer hayir penei kol mizrach, achu b'chevron v'hu mer hein. Now here, by the way they punctuated here, it's based on a different reading of this part of the Mishnah. Because you can also read it like this. You can break it up into two parts. You can say that the person who went up said, he made a statement, He'ir kol pnei kol hamizrach, and then people on the ground asked him, Ad shehu b'chevron, is it light all the way to Chevron? And then he responds, Hu omer hein. It's another way of reading. So I just wanted to point out that this was stuff that was going on every day in the Beit HaMikdash. And so it's interesting that the Bartenura, when he's explaining our Mishnah in Yoma, the way he ends it off, they were worried that this mistake of when sunrise took place could happen again on Yom Kippur, so that's why they needed this. But we see from the Mishnah in Masechet Tamid, it was not only on Yom Kippur that the Mimuneh would tell somebody to go up to some high place and determine whether or not sunrise has come about. And something that would happen. Okay. Let's continue. Horidu Kohen Gadol Leveit HaTvilah. So they took the Kohen Gadol down to the place where he would tavel. So of course now we are now back talking about Yom Kippur explicitly, as we'll see, because all of the avodah that was done in the Beit HaMikdash had to be done by the Kohen Gadol. And so the part that's missing here, as it were, that we saw in Masechet Tamid, is we don't see a payis. There isn't a payis here. Because actually the Kohen Gadol has to do all of the avodah per se. So here, there is no one else to choose. So bring him to the Beit HaTvilah. Zeh klal haya b'mikdash. And this was a general rule in the Mikdash. In other words, again, not only for Yom Kippur. Kol ha'meisech et raglav ta'un tvilah. V'chol ha'metil mayim ta'un kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. right? So anybody who would cover his legs, as we see the Bartenura explains, kinui nekavim gedolim. It's a kinui of a kinui. Right? So nekavim gedolim, of course, is a reference to defecation, right? But Hebrew is a very clean language. So they don't even say, kol shasa nekavav gedolim. They say kol mesechet raglav ta'un tefillah. So anybody who defecate in the mikdash, he had to tavel, right? In other words, our din is that after that we have to, whether we are urinating or defecating, we have to wash our hands. That's min hadin, that we have to wash our hands. But we don't have to tavel our hands, and we don't have to tavel our whole body. But if you were in the mikdash and you had to do those things, then you would actually have to do tefillah. And kol hamitil mayim ta'un kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Right? Anybody who urinates needs to do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, meaning that they have to wash their hands and legs. So, what's the relationship between zeh klal, this klal of tefillah and kiddush yadayim v'raglayim? Why is that brought after they say that Horidu Kohen Gadol Leveit HaTvilah? Do we? Any? Okay. So I mean, what's the point here? Because when it says Horidu Kohen Gadol Leveit HaTvilah, so we're going to. What have we done until now? We've determined that Hiyir Pnei Kol Mizrach Ad Shebechavron, or right. So we know it's time to do the shchita. So at this point, they're going to have the Kohen Gadol Tovel, right? He has to go to the mikvah. So this klal is not actually immediately pertinent to what we're talking about, right? In other words, it says that the Kohen Gadol has to go to Tavel. It doesn't say that the Kohen Gadol had to defecate and therefore he had to Tavel. He just had to Tavel. But the Mishnah wants us to know that Tefillah was required. Tefillah was required in certain cases. Let's see what the Bartenura says here. Horidu Kohen Gadol. They brought down the Kohen Gadol. So he says, Milta ba'anpe nafshahi. This is a matter unto itself. Bahashta mahadir lahad taninu la'el ad chevron v'omerhein l'char she'eshiva roehein hayu moridin kohen gadol v'beit ha'tvilah. So what does he mean? This, like we explained a second ago, this whole keta, Horidu Kohen Gadol v'beit ha'tvilah, is really the logical continuation of what happened at the end of Mishnah Aleph. And we interrupted with Mishnah at the beginning of Mishnah Bet just to explain why they did the procedure of making sure they knew it was Alot HaShachar. But once they knew that it was Shachar, say that again?
Why is V'hashta Mahadir Lahadi Tninan? Why is it in Aramaic?
Why does he write in Aramaic? Well, the Bartenura writes in that mixture of Aramaic and Hebrew. It's common.
Okay.
We've seen it before. V'hashta mahada v'hada taninan, right? So now he is going back to that which we learned earlier, ad chevron, v'hu omer hein. And after the person who saw says hein, then we get to this part, horida kohen gadol leveit tefillah. And why? Shayat ta'un tefillah kodem sheyishchat tamid. He had to tavel before he would shech the korban tamid. In other words, he has to tavel regardless of whether or not he used the bathroom, as it were, right? He has to tavel anyway, and that's continuing right now into Mishnah Gimel. Ein adam nichnas la'azara la'avoda afilu tahor ad sheyitbol. So now we clarify this a little bit more, and we say, not only do these people have to have Tevila or Kiddush Yadayim B'Raglayim, but actually anybody who goes into the Azara in order to do the Avodah, even if he is Tahor when he arrives, he can't go in until he tavels. And the Bartenura says, La Avodah lav dafka. It's even just to enter into the Azara. It's that you would need to tavel, even if you're not going to do avodah. Ad sheyitbol, and he explains why. Shadvarim kal v'chomer. It's a kal v'chomer that he has to tavel. Why? Ma kohen gadol mishaneh mekodesh lekodesh me'avodat chutz avodat pnim. Me'avodat pnim la'avodat chutz ta'un tevila bein avodah la'avodah zeh haba mibeito shehu mechol lekodesh lo kol shekain sheta'un tevila. Right? So he says, actually we learn it as a kal v'chomer from what the Kohen Gadol had to do on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol, and we talked about this when we learned Achremot, and then now we're going to see it in greater detail in the Mishnah. The Kohen Gadol, when he would change from doing avodat chutz to avodat pnim, right? Moves avodat chutz to do things that are outside of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, as opposed to the avodah that he did inside the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And vice versa, me'avodat pnim, me'avodat chutz. Each of those times that he changes from one type of avodah to another type of avodah, he had to tavel, even though he's going from kodesh to kodesh, right? Because there are different levels of kedusha in the mikdash, but he's going from one kodesh to another kodesh, and whether he's going from a higher kedusha to a lower kedusha, or a lower kedusha to a higher kedusha, he would have to tavel for each avodah. So this person, this Kohen Gadol now, who's coming, Zehabami Beito, Shehu Mechol, actually this is for anybody, right? So this is not the Kohen Gadol, because the Kohen Gadol was living in the Beit HaMikdash all week, as we learned in the first parak. But Ein Adam Nichnas LaZarah, right? This person now who's coming to the Azara, whoever that person may be, so he's coming outside of the Mikdash into the Mikdash, so all the more so that he would have to tavel in order to enter the Beit HaMikdash. Chamesh tevilot v'asara kiddushin tovel kohen gadol u'mekadesh bo bayom. V'chulan bekodesh al Beit HaParva chutz mizu bilvad. So on this day, on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol had to do 10 tevilot in a mikvah, and he had to wash his hands and legs. Those are the 10 kiddushin. Asara kiddushin, right? Chamesh tevilot v'asara kiddushin tovel Kohen Gadol, right? That refers back to the tevilot. Umekadesh refers back to the kiddushin on that day. V'chulan bekodesh, all of them were in Kodesh al Beit Parva. All of them were in Kodesh al Beit Parva, chutz mizu bilvad, except for this one alone. So all of what were in Kodesh al Beit Parva?
The Tevilot?
Yes, the Tvilot were all al Beit Parva, because where was the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim?
At the Kior.
Yes, right. It was at the Kior, right? So in other words, the Kior is a different place in the Beit HaMikdash. And Beit Parva was one of the places. It was a place in the Beit HaMikdash that had a mikvah. Just a second. I realize now I should have set this up before. I'm not going to find it now. I wanted to show where people think the Beit Parva is. So if you can imagine, just think of, hold on a second, I can bring it up. Just a second. I apologize. I realize now, I just remembered this. The last time that we were learning, I had this set up, but we didn't get this far. So hold on a second. I'm going to show you, this is a picture of the Beit HaMikdash based on the Perush of the Rambam. And it's not to scale, but it does give you like a general idea of where things were.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, this is in the back of a standard Mishnayot, like the standard Vilna Mishnayot. And this one, if you're interested, I'll tell you, you can download the whole set from HebrewBooks.org. This is the updated version of that set. So this is Lishkat Parva. So, right, normal people would come in here from Mizrach into the Ezrat Nashim. They go through Shar Nikanor, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This is Ezrat Yisrael. Then this section here is called Ezrat Kohanim. And so over here is this part called Lishkata Parva.
What is Parva?
So let's look at the Bartenura. There's an interesting story behind that. Just a second. Let's see. Al Beta Parva, Al Ishkat Beta Parva. Oh, he doesn't say it here, but I'll explain in a second. Chutz mizu bilvad, except for this tvila. In other words, so all the tvilot, the 5 tvilot, all except one of the 5 tvilot that the Kohen Gadol had to do on Yom Kippur was done Beta Parva, Alishkat Beta Parva, Chutz mizu harishona, except for this first one, Shahita B'chol, it was outside of the Mikdash, it was not in a part of the Mikdash that was Kadosh, Al Gabei Shar Hamayim, on top of the water gate, Uvitzad Lishkato Haita, and it was on the side of his Lishka, and let's do a quick share again. This is Shara Hamayim up here. That's Shara Hamayim. It's one of the 3 Sharim that come in from the side, and this is one of them. So apparently there was also a mikveh there. And that's where this was done. Okay, so what is Beit Parva? So Parva was apparently the name of a sorcerer, and the story is a bit strange. It's brought down here in the Gemara, and they're Rishonim, I think Rabbeinu Hananel explains that why was the Lishka called after this sorcerer, that apparently he had, through some kind of witchcraft or sorcery, had dug underneath this Lishka because he was trying to dig his way to get to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, because he wanted to be able to see what happened in the Kodesh HaKodeshim on Yom Kippur. And they caught him, and he didn't succeed. But they named this Lishka after him, which I find completely bizarre.
Shel?
Yes.
The Kohen Gadol has to go through the Ezrat Israel to get to the Lishkat HaParva, which is strange because
no, but he doesn't.
Everybody would see him, and he might also touch somebody, I don't know, on his way. And
No, but he doesn't. He comes over here to Shar Hamayim. So because the whole time he's been living in the Beit HaMikdash. So when I mentioned this entrance from Shar HaMizrach, this is how normal people would come in. The Kohen Gadol did not go through Ezrat Nashim and Ezrat Yisrael.
The door opens towards Ezrat Israel, so there was another door or something like this.
Well, there was Sha'arim.
Or a tunnel, or I don't know.
No, it was out in the open, but there were actual Sha'arim, and at Shar Nikanor there was an actual gate. There were doors, and this is also one of the other things I've been trying to prepare a little bit on the side, to do selected parts from Masechet Midot, so we can get a better picture of the whole setup. This picture here is very it's very simplified. It's not bad. I mean, it's helpful. But it's very simplified. And in some ways, it's actually not that helpful. But there's a more detailed one. Just a second. There's a more detailed one that's based on the parish of the Tosfos Yom Tov, which is better in some regards, but none of them are done to scale. Like the measurements here do not really correspond one-to-one with the measurements that the Mishnah lays out. So they're helpful, but they're kind of of limited use, which is too bad. But that's what we have. In this picture, this would be this area here would be Shar Hamayim. This was a Shar Hamayim. And over here, this would be Lishkat Beit HaParva. B'li Neder. It's something actually, this is a project I've been working on and off myself, to draft better blueprints. So you can see some of these things better. So as we get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty, I think I'm going to try to prepare some more of that. Since Michael mentioned that the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, that was done at the Kior, so this is the Kior in this picture. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. You'll see that it's in between the Mizbeach, right? This is the Mizbeach. And this is the entrance to the ulam, Petach ha'ulam, goes into the Beit HaMikdash proper. So it was over here that the kior stood.
So it's outside the Beit HaMikdash.
It's outside of the Beit HaMikdash proper. Yes, it's
the building, outside the building.
The Azara. Correct. It's in the Azara. It's outside, and you'll see in this little picture here. You'll see right. So they made it kind of look like a well. It has what looks like a chain or a rope that goes down. That's to indicate the way that the kior worked at this time in the Second Temple, and we'll talk about it in a moment. I'll explain that in a moment. Let's go back to the Mishnah. Okay, so in any event, so this is what we know. We know that on a normal day, the Memuneh would, before all of this would take place, he would do the first payis and choose everybody to do their various avodot. Then he would have sent somebody to look and make sure that it's lit up and it's man shchita. And on Yom Kippur, because there's no payis, this is where things start. Basically, we mentioned Trumat HaDeshen earlier, but the avodah per se that's in the day starts now, because Trumat HaDeshen can be at night. And they would bring the Kohen and they would have him go to Tavel at this mikveh that's at Shar HaMayim. And then we learned that the Kohen Gadol Lav Dafka, but anybody who would come into the Beit HaMikdash had to Tavel before he would come into the Azara. And today, particularly, the Kohen Gadol has to do 5 tevilot, and we will count them as we go through. And he had to wash his hands and legs 10 times. So let's move on now to Mishnah Daled. Persus adin shel butz, beino levein ha'am. They spread out a sheet that was made of fine linen between him and between the people. So where the people were, by the way, it's not entirely clear to me if, it seems to me, right, you could have people who were in Ezrat Nashim and in Ezrat Yisrael, but what you should understand is those are graded. If you're in the Ezrat Nashim, you're significantly lower down than the level of the Azara where the avodah is going to take place. And even if you're in if you're in Ezrat Yisrael, which is next up, you're still down, right? The ma'alot, the Chamesh Esrei ma'alot that they sang the Shirei HaMa'alot on, were 15 steps that went between Ezrat Yisrael to Ezrat HaKohanim. So all of these places are lower down. So presumably there were people in those places. It's not clear to me how much they could see. It seems to me that in principle, people could have been on Har HaBayit, outside of the Beit HaMikdash, looking in. But of course, there's a wall. I just have not yet figured out exactly what the logistics were of the Am that's being spoken about here, that people could see. But not only from here, we'll see from here and from other Mishnayot, that there were people in different spots that could see whenever the Kohen Gadol was in the outside doing like work at or near the Mizbeach, but they couldn't all see the same things, right? Because there were different angles. So we'll try to keep that in mind. I'll do my best to try to figure it out. I don't have it's not clear in my own mind exactly where people were going to be standing. But Persus Sadin Shal Butz Beino Levein Ha'am. Pashat, right? So he would undress, yarad v'taval. He would undress, he would go down, and he would tavel. Alav v'nistapeg. And he would get up and dry himself off, wipe himself off. Heviu lo bigdei zahav. They would bring to him the golden clothes. V'lavash v'kidesh yadav v'ragvav. So then he would dress in the clothes. So we understand that there's this sadin that's to give him privacy because he has to strip naked to go to the mikveh. And then he has to get up and he has to dry off. And in all the time that he isn't dressed, he's cut off from the rest of the people with this sadin shel boots. Once he had on his bigdei zahav, then he had to go and wash his hands and legs. Heviu lo et tamid. Then they would bring him the korban tamid. In Masechet Tamid, they talk a little bit more about the daily, like the preparations for getting the tamid. There was a kohen who would go to get it. They would have it drink some water before it was taken out to slaughter. It's all described over there. But for our purposes, it's enough to know that they had prepared a taleh, they prepared a lamb to be brought. Heviu lo et tamid. Kirtzo u'meirak acher shchita al yado. So he would be koretz. So what's koretz? So the Bartenura explains, Kratzo shchato barov shnei simanim. Kritza is a it's like a minimal shchita. He shechted it in this minimal way that he cut through most of the two simanim. When we talk about simanim vis-a-vis shchita, we mean the kaneh and the veshet. So we need the windpipe and the main artery. What constitutes a kosher shchita is when the knife cuts through most of the kaneh and most of the veshet. That's sufficient. That's the minimal amount that you need for a kosher shchita. So on this day, on Yom Kippur, the shchita presumably has to be done by the Kohen Gadol. So he does the minimum shchita, kertzo or kratzo. He does rov shnei simanim. Umeirek acher shchita al yado. Umeirak acher, it was emptied out. Somebody else empties out the shchita al yado, next to him or for him, as the Bartenura explains. So, what does it mean? The Gamar Kohen Acher, the Bartenura says, another Kohen finishes the shchita. That's the Meirah. L'fi she'en kabbalat adam kshera ela b'kohen gadol v'tzarich l'meher l'kabel. So if you remember when we learned about the paisot, that one of the paisot, just a second. So we said when we learned the paisot, I'll just bring this up again quickly, just to remind us. So the paisot sheni mishochet mizorek mibidashem mizbech hapnimi, etc. So the Bartenura explained to us, kol ha'avodot halalu b'fayis echad hen. These are all part of the same payis. Shemish yichle bo cheshbon kamosh v'irash nuzacha. Whoever whoever the number landed off, right, the number that was being counted to landed on, he merited. V'hu zorek et hadam b'mizbeach achar shekibel hadam b'mizrak. So whoever in the first count of the pies, the way it worked, there would be the random number. They would count around in a circle until they land on whoever it lands on, and he's zocheh to be zorek. Zorek. So the first person landed on was the zorek et hadam. After he received the blood, right? After he caught the blood in this mizrak, which was a cleave that was designed for capturing blood at the time of the shechita. And the shochet, even though he's mentioned first, was actually not the person who won. He would be the person next to the zorek. So the zorek was also the mikabel. Whoever was going to ultimately throw the blood onto the mizbeach on a normal day, he was mikabel et hadam. And the person next to him was actually the shochet, just to remind us about all of that. So when it's Yom Kippur, so what's the deal? The Kohen Gadol has to be the one to be mikabel the blood, and he has to be the one to sprinkle it onto to throw it, or however you want to describe that, to throw it onto the mizbeach. So since he was also the one who's supposed to do the shechita, it was very tricky. He had to shecht it and then right away capture the blood. So what he did is he did this partial shechita, which was a kosher shechita, but then he would hand the knife over to another kohen to finish that so that he could grab a mizrak and capture the blood as it's coming out of the keves. Then he would take the blood, and then he'd go over to the mizbeach, and he would be zorek al hamizbeach. Right. This rika, of course, we're still talking about the korban tamid. Nichnas lektir k'toret shel shachar. He would go in then to bring the k'toret shel shachar, u'hativ et nerot, and then to fix up the nerot of the menorah, u'hakriv et harosh vet evarim, and then he would come out again to bring up the head and the parts of the animal, the limbs of the animal, onto the mizbeach, vet hachavitin, vet hayayin. And then he would do the cakes of the Kohen Gadol and the wine. So let's just go back and fill out with the Bartenura, and we'll fill in some of the other things that are going on here. Sadin shalbut, right? So they would spread out this sheet of fine linen. Kidei shiakir shavodat hayom b'bigdei boots. Right, so why did they use fine linen? That was to indicate, I'd like to remind everybody that this is Yom Kippur, and that the avodah that was special for Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol was going to do wearing bigdei boots, wearing fine linen clothes. Because, right, he was accustomed throughout the year to do his avodah in the golden clothes, right, the regular clothes of the Kohen Gadol. Right, so he would go down. Hashat yarad v'taval alav v'nistapeg. He'd get up and he'd dry off. He would wipe himself off. Then he would, they would bring him bigdei zahav, and he would get dressed. V'kidesh yadav v'raglav. So Bartenura explains, min ha-kiyor, right? He would go and he would wash his hands and legs from the kiyor. Shetzarich lechol chalifot bigdei hayom kiddush l'fshita v'kiddush l'lbisha. So the way we're going to end up with 10 kiddushei yadayim v'raglayim is there's going to be chamesh tevilot, and that's for each time that he has to change his clothes. And so for each of those, he has to do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim for taking off his clothes, and he has to do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim for putting on the next set of clothes. U'tvila rishona zu, this first tvila, shapshita shel bigdei cholhi. So this first time that he's taking his clothes off, since he's taking off his daily clothes, not his clothes as a kohen, lo hutzrach kiddush yadayim v'raglayim al hapshita. So this one here, this pashat yarad b'tabal, right? He doesn't have to do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim when he took his clothes off to go to the mikveh the first time. So of course, then it's not immediately clear how we're going to end up with 10, but we'll see how we end up with 10. But right, so right now, to keep count, he goes to Shar Hamayim, he gets undressed, and he does his first tevilah. Then they bring him the bigdei zahav, and he puts them on. And once he puts them on, now that he has his clothes for avodah on, he has to go wash his hands and his legs. Okay. Kratzo, shvato barov shnei simanim, hatsher shlita bilvad, right, enough just to make a kosher shlita. Meirak acher, v'gamar kohen acher b'shlita. Somebody else would finish his shlita. L'fi she'ein kabbalat adam kshera ela b'kohen gadol, v'tzarich lemaher l'kabel. Right, so why do we do it that way? Because he, as the kohen gadol, he has to do the kabbalah, which is part of the avodah. It's that in and of itself is an avodah, and so he has to run or quickly do the kabbalat adam. So we let somebody else finish the shlita. This raises a question, which I didn't see an answer to right away, and hopefully I'll find an answer. It's not clear to me why it is then that you have to have the Kohen Gadol do the Shlita at all. Because as we mentioned earlier, the Shlita is not avodah per se, because it can be done even by a non-Kohen. But I think the answer is that nonetheless, on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol should in any event do that, even if it's just a hechsher avodah. In other words, you need to do the shlita in order to do all the other avodot that are associated with the korban tamid. You can't do any of the other ones unless you do the shlita. So, arguably, the Kohen Gadol who has to do all the other avodot, so presumably then he should also be the one to do this shlita, which is like the hechsher for. It's the preparation for all the rest of the avodah. I'm sure that somebody must speak about it explicitly, but I haven't found it yet.
It might also be teaching us a midah.
That what?
That you take responsibility for the entire endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
Or something.
No, I like them. Yeah. It's up to him to make sure that all the steps are done.
Sure.
Me'rak acher shlita al yado, meaning bishvilo. Somebody else finishes the shlita for him. That's one way of understanding al yado. Inami al yado, or else al yado could mean acharav v'samuch lo, right next to him, or right after him, immediately. Me'rak acher shlita al yado, kamo v'al yado hechzik v'sefer Ezra.
Shay?
Yes.
I don't like the idea that two people are doing the shchita, because the poor lamb will be suffering with this thing. It would be better to do it in one blow.
Well, I'm not an expert in shchita, but as I understand it from the Gemara and Chulin, like in other words, I've never done an actual shchita, and I've never even witnessed an actual shchita. But this pula, it's usually done in any event in two. It's not usually done in one swoop, because that's halachically it's problematic. Like you don't bring it down. You can't bring it down like a guillotine. That's a sur, because that in itself is not a kosher shkita. You have to do it in this kind of pulling, pushing movement. So it seems to me that it's not unreasonable, and these are kohanim who are like they're all shochtim, right? In other words, they're accustomed to doing this. That I think the way it would work is that the kohen gadol, he would do the first one or two movements, then the animal is shechted. At that point, the animal is shechted. So the other one is just going there to maybe do one or two more pulls. How much the animal suffers, I can't say, because I think the animal, honestly, I think that animals suffer anytime there's a shkita. I don't know that they would suffer more in this particular fashion. But I don't know. I'm not a shochet. I learned Hilchos Shchita and I learned the Gemaras there a while back, but I can't say more than that. I just know that was the pula. That's how it was done. The other thing I wanted to point out here, these other avodot. There's a lot of discussion about the particular order of things being done here, and the discussion starts already, elsewhere, like in the Mishnah Tamid as well. Which things I do in which order it's all very interesting. It's all very significant. And it's not, what I'll tell you, there's machloket about the order as it's being presented. I don't want to get deeply into it. I think we will revisit it from time to time. But let's just understand what are the things that are being done. So the order as it's being presented to us is, so the first thing that was done on this day, for Yom Kippur, there was Trumat HaDeshem. That was much earlier. Then we bring the Kohen in to do the Shchita, and he takes the blood and he sprinkles it or throws it appropriately onto the place that he needs to throw it on, the Mizbeach, meaning the outer Mizbeach. And then he would go in to bring the Ketoret Shel Shachar, according to this. And after the Ketoret, he would be Meitiv et HaNeirot. And we did touch on this Hantavat HaNeirot in an earlier shiur. And it's a very tricky thing, but basically he's going to look and clean up if any of the lights went out, to clean them, and take care of any attendant things with the menorah. Then he would have come out makriv et harosh v'et ha'evarim. He would come out to be makriv the head and the limbs of the korban tamid. So it leaves out the fact that after he shechted the animal, presumably, one of the other kohanim cut it up for him, right? Because it had to be cut into its various parts. And it'll talk about this a little bit later, I think, that he would bring them in and then line them up on the kevesh, and then he has to bring all of the parts onto the mizbeach. V'eta chavitin, v'eta yain. So what are the chavitin? So just to remind us of the chavitin, wait a second. Where did I put that? Here we go. So in right, so this is in Parshat Tzav. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, right? Vayikra Perek Vav. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor. Zeh korban Aaron uvanav, asher yakrivu Hashem biyom himashach oto. This is the korban of Aaron and his sons that he will bring to Hashem on the day that he is anointed. Asiri ta'ifa, a tenth of an ephah of solet, of fine flour, mincha tamid. Right, so this is a mincha that it's, in other words, the first time it's brought is the day that Aaron and his sons are nimshach, but it's a korban tamid. It's also something that has to be brought every day in the Beit HaMikdash. Machatzita baboker, half of it is brought in the morning. Machatzita ba'erev, half of it is brought in the evening. And then it explains how to do it on machabat b'shem and teyasem or bechet tibyen, etc. And kol minchat kohen kalil tihya lo teachel. Right, so this was a korban mincha that was brought. It was baked and then in the morning, and then then half of it would be brought in the morning, and half of it would be brought in the evening, and none of it was eaten. It's described in a little bit more detail in Masechet Menachot. We'll just take a quick glance at that. This is Masechet Menachot, Perek Dal, Chavitei Kohen Gadol. Right, so these cakes of the Kohen Gadol, Lo Hayu Ba'ot Chatzayim. They would never come by halves. Elamevi Saron Shalem, V'chotsehu. So he would bring a whole isaron of the mincha. In other words, you had to bake it as a whole, and then divide it into half. Mechza b'shacharit, makriv mechza b'boker, mechza ben ha'arbaim. Okay, we can. I don't think we have to do the rest for right now, but if you want, please take a look there. Let's just continue a little bit further back in the Mishnah, and then I think we'll finish. Okay, so these things that he's doing here in Mishnah Daled, these are things that were brought every day. So now we will get, I think this is what we'll do. Let's read Mishnah Hay, and we'll look a little bit at the Bartenura, but I think we may go over this again next week. K'taret shel shachar hayta kreva bein dam le'evarim. The k'taret of the morning was brought between blood and the limbs. So what's the blood? What's the blood that's being referred to?
That's the initial blood that was thrown, that was first collected and then thrown.
Right. So the dam would be the zrikat dam that we mentioned earlier. Right. That over here he says kibel dam uzrako, and then after that it says nichnas laktir ktaret laitiv v'taneirot lakriv v'tarosh and then lakriv v'tarosh v'ta'ivarim. So it says, K'taret shel shachar hayta kreva bein dam le'evarim. Shel bein ha'arbaim, bein evarim la'nisachim. Right, we have to talk about the nisachim. Im haya kohen gadol zaken o istin. All right, we'll read that. Im haya kohen gadol zaken o istinis. If the kohen gadol was old or he was an istinis, he was sort of a frail person. They would warm up hot water for him. metilin l'toch hatzonein, and they would put it into the cold water of the mikvah, kedei shetafug tzinatan, in order to absorb the coldness. This part I think we'll definitely do next week. Let's look at the Bartenura on the first part. Bein dam le'evarim, lav dafka. Lav dafka. It's not necessarily that the Ketara was done between dam and evarim. The hatanan le'el, yikibet adam, uzrako, niknas lektir Ketara, t'lativ v'tenerot, akriv v'tarosh v'tevarim, alma, הייתה קטורת קרבה בין דם לנרות, לא בין דם לאיברים. In other words, he's just being medayek. In other words, in the big picture, that yes, the Ketara was done between after he did Zrikat Adam and before he brought the Ivarim onto the Mizbeach, but he also did other things after he did the Dam and the Ketara. So the way the Mishnah lays it out is that first he sprinkled the blood, and then right after he did the blood is when he would do the Ketara, but then he would also do the menorah, and only then he would do the Rosh Ve'evarim. Right? Alma hayta Ketara kreva bein dam lenerot, v'lo bein dam le'evarim. Right? It wasn't right between the dam and the evarim. Ela lo ba'hatana achshav lomar Seder HaKorbanot Zu Achar Zu Echayu. The Tana here isn't coming to tell you, I said Seder HaKorbanot, Seder HaHakravot. He's not coming to tell you the different offerings, the precise way they were done one after the other, the order of the way they were done. Avaratzan Lomar Bilvad שלא הייתה זריקת הדם והקרבת האיברים מצופים זו אחר זו. I just wanted to make sure that you understood that the throwing of the blood and the bringing of the limbs, those were not right next to each other. Sheharei haktoret hayta mafseket beinehem, because the Ketara was in between them. V'hu hadin nami shehatavat hanerot hayta beinehem le'achar haktoret. It was also true that the fixing up of the menorah was also in between them. Kodem hakravat ha'evarim. But the reason it says bein dam le'evarim is just to make sure that you know that the Ketara was done after the dam, but there were these things that were done between the time of the throwing of the blood and the time of the bringing of the limbs onto the mizbeach. We'll finish off the Bartenura. If he was an istinis shigufo mitzunan bekar, if he had a frigid and cold body, the chamin lo chamin, they would warm up hot water for him. The erev Yom Kippurim, right? So they would get hot water ready before Yom Kippur. Tilin the Yom Kippurim otoch hakak binyan beit tfilato. So they would be able to put the water on Yom Kippur into a hollowed out part that was in or maybe right next to the mikveh, so that it would go into the mikveh and warm up the mikveh water. So they don't say to warm up the mikveh water, but they put it this way: "Shetafud lasir tzinatan b'miktzat," right? To lessen the coldness. Right? This is the same word we saw in the first chapter when we told the Kohen Gadol who was falling asleep, Hafeg achat ala ritzpah. It's the same word. So it's to absorb or to in this sense it's like to dissipate the coldness. Okay, I think, B'li Neder, next time I do want to talk a little bit more about this, and I'll try to bring some more sources. Not to dwell on it too much, but hopefully just to clarify it a little bit more, and then we'll continue then from there to Mishnah Vav. So are there any? Okay, well, it's wonderful to have you and see you again. And Bezrat Hashem, we'll meet again next week.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Good night.